Some nights in the NBA don't call for a recap. No scoreboard rundown, no urgency to rank or react. Sometimes the league just asks you to check in, to look around, to notice what's steady, to notice what's quietly working. I'm Vincent Cooper, and this is Round Ball Rants. Welcome to the overnight shift. This isn't a results show tonight. This is one of those moments where the league doesn't need to be summarized. It needs to be observed. Because when the NBA goes through stretches like this, when there's no scramble for headlines, no standings panic, no urgency to react, you start to see which players are actually settling into something real. So this is a check-in, not a spotlight, not a debate, just a look at Russell Westbrook, where he is right now, how he's producing, and why this stretch deserves to be acknowledged. If you want a clean snapshot of what this version of Russ looks like, go back to Monday night against Indiana. Sacramento didn't win the game. That's important to say out loud. This isn't a victory lap. This isn't rewriting outcomes. But Westbrook finished that night with 24 points, 14 assists, and 13 rebounds. A triple-double that came quietly, organically, and without turning the game into a referendum on himself. And that distinction matters. Because the triple-double wasn't chased. It wasn't forced late. It didn't hijack possessions. It just happened. Inside the flow of the game. Inside the structure of the offense. Inside the rhythm of a team that wasn't bending itself around him. That's a part worth paying attention to. Russell Westbrook has spent a lot of his career being discussed beyond the box score. Not just how he played, but what came with him. The intensity, the presence, the questions about fit, role, off-court gravity. For a long time, every stop came with the same undertone. Can this work? Will this be too loud? Does the production justify the complication? Those questions didn't come out of nowhere. They were built over years of being central, sometimes overwhelmingly so. Which is why what's happening now stands out. Because in Sacramento, that conversation simply isn't happening. Not because Russ has disappeared, but because he's quietly doing his job. Watch that Pacers game again. And what jumps out isn't dominance. It's control. He's not hunting shots. He's not pounding the air out of the ball. He's not demanding the offense bend to him. He's reading the floor. Finding cutters. Advancing the ball early. Pushing tempo when the advantage is there. And pulling it back when it isn't. That's not accidental. That's a veteran who understands exactly what this stage of his career requires. This isn't Russ trying to prove that he's still Russ. This is Russ playing like someone who knows how to be useful and knows that usefulness looks a lot different now. And here's the part that deserves to be said plainly. There's been no off-court noise attached during this stretch. No quotes about leaking frustration. No rotation drama. No whispers about locker room tension. He's not dominating the room. He's not shrinking from it either. He's showing up, producing, and letting the game move on. In today's NBA, where chemistry is fragile and margins are thin, that kind of presence matters. Sometimes silence isn't absence. It's confirmation. When people describe this stretch as prime-like, it's important to be precise. This isn't MVP year usage. This isn't the ball every possession. But the impact per minute feels familiar. The burst is still there. The competitiveness is still there. The pressure he puts on defenses is still real. What changed is how it's deployed. Shorter stretches, clearer windows, defined purpose, and that's why it works. Now, naturally, people will jump ahead. They'll see the stat line. They'll see the energy. They'll start wondering about deadlines and destinations. That's not what this is. This isn't about insisting the call will come. It's about acknowledging that this version of Russell Westbrook creates optionality for Sacramento, for contenders quietly watching, and for how his career is ultimately remembered. Because whether he stays exactly where he is, or he becomes a piece somewhere else later on, this stretch matters. Not because it's spectacular, but because it's trustworthy. That Pacers game didn't rewrite his career. It didn't need to. It simply showed that the burst is still there, the feel is still there, and the willingness to fit rather than force is very real. And that's how late career chapters are earned. Not with noise, not with declarations, but with steady, quiet production that makes people stop and say, yeah, that still works. That's the check-in. And if Russ is a reminder of what quiet production looks like late in a career, then Chris Paul is the other side of that coin. Because with him, it isn't the production people argue about. It's the accountability. So let's check in there. We've already talked about how it ended in Los Angeles. That part is done. What's worth addressing now is what comes after, when Chris Paul stopped being a Clipper and became a national talking point. Because almost immediately, the narrative shifted. Not about basketball fit, not about age, not about minutes or schemes. It became about personality. And specifically, the idea that Chris Paul's approach to accountability didn't just wear thin. That's what drove him out. That framing needs to be challenged. And let's start here. Chris Paul didn't suddenly become demanding. He didn't wake up in Los Angeles and decide that he was going to be difficult. He's been this way for 2 decades. Detail obsessed, direct, unwilling to let things slide. That personality didn't just coexist with his success. It's what fueled it. It's why bad teams became respectable overnight. Why young players learned how to win. Why coaches trusted him with the keys. For most of his career, that wasn't called toxicity. It was called leadership. So when the post-dismissal narrative turned that same behavior into a flaw, it wasn't really an evaluation of Chris Paul. It was a reflection of where the league is right now, because accountability has quietly become uncomfortable. There's a difference between toxicity and tension. Toxicity tears down without purpose. Accountability creates discomfort in service of improvement. Chris Paul has always lived in the second category. He calls things out because details matter. He demands focus because possessions matter. He pushes because he believes that the standards matter. That doesn't mean that everyone enjoys it. But leadership isn't measured by comfort. It's measured by clarity. What the national conversation often skips over is this: winning environments are rarely peaceful. They're structured. They're demanding. They require confrontation. Not conflict, but confrontation. And Chris Paul has not been afraid of that. That doesn't make him toxic. It makes him honest. Now, could the Clippers have decided they needed a different tone? Absolutely. That's a fair organizational choice. But that's not the same as saying that Chris Paul was the problem. Fit matters. Timing matters. Rooms evolve. A dismissal doesn't automatically equal failure. and it certainly doesn't rewrite a leadership resume that was built over the last 20 years. What's concerning is how quickly the talking head narrative flattened the story, as if demanding accountability is outdated, as if leadership now has to whisper to be valid. That's a dangerous precedent, because when accountability is labeled toxic too easily, standards erode quietly. Nobody wants to be that guy. Nobody wants to be framed as difficult. So expectations lower, and mediocrity gets comfortable. Chris Paul represents the opposite of that. He represents a belief that details deserve attention, mistakes deserve correction, and winning deserves honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. And here's the part that often gets ignored. Accountability only feels toxic when it's not matched by a shared commitment. If everyone in the room is pulling in the same direction, accountability feels like alignment. If they're not, it feels like pressure. That doesn't mean accountability is wrong. It means that the room wasn't aligned. So defending Chris Paul here isn't about pretending that he's perfect. It's about pushing back on the idea that his core leadership trait, the thing that made him great, suddenly became unacceptable. Leadership doesn't expire just because it makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes discomfort is the work. This is also why this conversation matters beyond Chris Paul, because the league is quietly declaring what kind of leadership it still values. Do we want leaders who challenge, or leaders who smooth everything over? Do we want accountability that sharpens, or harmony that avoids friction? The best teams usually choose the first, even if they don't want to admit it publicly. Chris Paul didn't lose his standards. The Clippers chose a different path. Those two things can coexist without turning accountability into a character flaw. And if we're still being honest with ourselves, the league still needs players willing to say the hard thing before it becomes the costly thing. That's not toxicity. That's leadership, even when it's inconvenient. That's the check-in, and it's worth saying out loud. Before we move on, a quick pause. If you're listening to this, and this conversation is resonating with you about leadership, accountability, and how the league treats its veterans, this is exactly what Round Ball Rants is built for. If you haven't already, make sure you're following the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe. We're building something intentional here, episode by episode. And if you got thoughts on this, on Chris Paul, on accountability, on where the line really is, our call-in line is always open. 216-452-8813. Leave a voicemail, react to the episode, add to the conversation. All right, let's keep going. At some point, every great competitor reaches this stage. Not the decline stage. Not the can he still play stage. The stage where the league stops arguing about your game and starts arguing about your presence. That's where Chris Paul is right now. And if we're being honest, this isn't new territory for the NBA. We've seen this before. Strong voices, demanding leaders, players who refuse to let standards slip. Late in their careers, those players almost always get reframed. What was once called intensity becomes too much. What was once called leadership becomes hard to deal with. What was once called accountability becomes toxic. Not because the traits changed, but because the room around them did. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Accountability costs something. It costs comfort. It costs ego. it costs excuses. And the deeper a league leans into player empowerment and emotional awareness, which are good things, the harder it becomes to make space for leaders who are willing to challenge people directly, not cruelly, not recklessly, but honestly. Chris Paul has never been a leader who lets things slide. That's not his wiring. He believes mistakes should be addressed in real time, that detail matters immediately, not later, that winning isn't accidental. Those beliefs built his entire career, and they didn't suddenly become wrong just because they became inconvenient. What's really happening in the moment isn't a rejection of Chris Paul. It's a tension that the league hasn't fully resolved yet. How do you balance accountability and empathy, standards and harmony, leadership and collaboration? Because when that balance isn't shared, someone always ends up labeled as the problem. And more often than not, it's the one asking the most of the room. This is why the moment matters beyond Chris Paul. If the league decides that accountability must always arrive softly, then urgency fades. And if leadership must always be comfortable, then honesty gets delayed. And delayed honesty is how small issues become big ones. The best teams in this league still know that. They may communicate differently now, but they still demand. They still confront. They still hold people to something higher than the vibes. Legacy isn't just about how you entered the league. It's about what you refuse to give up on the way out. Chris Paul refused to give up the standards, refused to lower his expectations, refused to pretend that the details don't matter. That won't always make you popular, but it will always make you clear. And clarity is what this episode has really been about. Russell Westbrook finding clarity through restraint. Chris Paul holding clarity through conviction. Two different paths, same truth. There's dignity in adapting, and there's dignity in standing firm. Both matter. The danger is letting the loudest narratives rewrite the quiet work. Letting discomfort get mislabeled. Letting accountability get confused with toxicity. Letting leadership be softened until it no longer leads. That's not growth. That's avoidance. Chris Paul's story isn't finished. But even if this chapter feels messy, it doesn't erase what he's represented. Precision, demand, care expressed through challenge. And if that makes some rooms uncomfortable, maybe that's the point. Because sometimes the leaders we push away are the ones reminding us that winning still requires honesty. And that truth, more than any stat line or headline, is what echoes long after the noise fades. And that is where we take a breath and bring this thing home. Before we close this out, let's take a moment with our partner Dubby. If you've been grinding early mornings, late nights, long days, and you want clean energy without the crash, Dubby's built for that. No sugar, no jitters, no nonsense. Just focus that lasts when you need it. Head to dubby.gg and use code Round Ball Rants to support the show and to check them out. And real quick, I was planning on doing a Dubby dime today, but my new flavor, it hasn't landed yet. When it does, we'll give it the proper breakdown. No rush, no filler. Alright, now let's really bring this thing home. Before we go, let's sit with something just for a moment. Because we've talked a lot today about accountability, what it looks like in the league, and what it costs. and why it still matters. But accountability doesn't just live on the court. It follows us into December, into the holidays, into rooms where expectations feel heavier than usual. And this is the part that we don't always say out loud. Accountability isn't about carrying everything. It's about carrying what's yours and knowing when to put the rest down. This time of year has a way of stacking responsibilities. Be present, be grateful, be productive, be strong, be okay. And somewhere in all of that, it's easy to turn accountability into pressure, to confuse the discipline with punishment. But real accountability, it has compassion built into it. It asks for honesty, not perfection, effort, not exhaustion, intent, not overload. Holding yourself to a standard doesn't mean that you can't rest. It doesn't mean that you can't say, today, this is enough. It doesn't mean that you failed because you didn't carry everything perfectly. Sometimes accountability is simply showing up, even quietly, and trusting that consistency matters more than intensity. We saw that tonight in different ways, in quiet production and in firm standards, in leaders who adapt without disappearing. And the same thing applies to us. You don't have to win December. You just have to move through it honestly. So, if the holidays feel heavy right now, take a breath. Hold yourself accountable, but don't hold yourself hostage. Progress still counts when it's slow. Care still counts when it's quiet. And showing up, even imperfectly, is more than enough. I'm Vincent Cooper. This was Round Ball Rants. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. And remember, it's not just basketball. It's therapy with a bounce.